Today, we know that the impact of network, digital media, and cultural production has been vast, bringing both opportunities and challenges to creators. But what waits for us with this new medium of VR? Anna Serrano is the Chief Digital Officer of the CFC and founder of CFC Media Lab, the world renowned Institute for Interactive Storytelling. Today, she joins us on the main stage to discuss what should matter to VR. Please join me in welcoming Anna to the stage.
On.
Here's her clicker. You got it.
What? I've got my clicker here. Hi, everyone. Okay, so first of all, wasn't Curtis amazing? He's really one of my favorite VR designers and storytellers of all time, and I think he's sticking around all day. So he's well worth. He probably won't want me to say this, but he's well worth going after and talking for a bit longer. So, what should matter to VR? Well, a lot of people kind of equate this moment in time as being very similar to 1994 when Netscape was launched. I don't know if many of you in this room remember that. But what's really important, I think, is to kind of understand what the context of the socio-political, economic, cultural environment was, technological as well, during that time in 1994. So I thought, what's a good way to do this? Well, I just essentially looked through all the Time magazine covers in 1994, and you can see in one fell swoop what were the preoccupations, admittedly of a very US-centric population at that time. So you've got, the troubles with Clinton, you've got the O.J. Simpson trial, you've got Nelson Mandela's rise, and at the very bottom there, the advent of the internet. So fast forward to today, or actually in 2012, Oculus Rift enters the scene. That's sort of the equation there, the 1994 Netscape browser launching and the Oculus Rift Kickstarter campaign in 2012. And lo and behold, what was happening with Time magazine during the 2015s, and we've got sort of a similar set of issues with the Clintons, except it's the other Clinton instead of the previous one. You've got, instead of the O.J. Simpson trial, you've got the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. You have a new peace guy in the works with Pope Francis. And of course, we have that unfortunate photo of Palmer Luckey ushering virtual reality. Now, if we compare 1994 to 2016, we might assume just from these Time magazine covers that the context of our environment hasn't changed that much, right? We have the Clintons, we've got, people who are peace-loving, rising, etc. But really, a lot has changed over the course of those years. And we only need to look at the type of knowledge that has been published over the course of those years that should affect the way we think about how to design our technologies and how to design our culture. In particular, I've highlighted three major works that I think are changing the way we think about things. Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which is sort of that milestone book that really speaks to inequality and all of the issues we're talking about today socially, and certainly that's a very big point during the American elections this year. Sherry Turkle's groundbreaking research around the impact of technologies, not just on people and individuals, but on families. And so I talk a lot about the fact that when I started in the 1990s in the digital space, you'd have pundits, like 40 or 50-year-old somethings on stage, and they'd say things like, they'd use sort of anecdotal evidence of their children as a marker for their technological prowess. So they'll say, my child uses the internet, and therefore I know how these things work. Fast forward today, you have similar pundits, except now it's people like me with 7-year-olds who sit on stage and say, I have a child and I can't get him off Minecraft. So we have a very different kind of sets of circumstances around how we think about technology and its effect on ourselves and on our families. And then, of course, last but not least, we've got a whole, hopefully, more informed populists, although again, I'm not quite sure with the US elections whether this is the case, surrounding climate change. So this is now a reality that we all have to live with. So this is kind of the context that we find ourselves in as we design for technology. And I haven't even talked about the fact here, I'm just using these books, about the rise of FANG, right? Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, and that they're now the largest economic powerhouses that we've ever seen in our lives today. So what should we think about given the fact that the context in which we're designing VR is no longer 1994? How do we temper the buoyancy and the sort of almost myopic techno-deterministic bubble that we could be in as we design content, as we design technologies, VR technologies? So today I'd just like to go over some of the issues that I think we should think about as developers and as content creators. The first thing that I think is very important for us to understand is that the business model of the internet is actually quite fixed right now. Many of the major companies that I've talked about, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, they really generate wealth by capitalizing on what Google popularized as the zero moment of truth, right? So the moments of truth framework was this retail framework popularized by A.G. Lafley that says that the first moment of truth is when the consumer is in front of a point of purchase display in a grocery store and they see how nicely packaged everything is, and so they choose from what they see. They purchase that, and then the second moment of truth is when they actually consume that product. Well, when search became a reality and when the internet became a reality, Google essentially took that framework and added to it, which was the zero moment of truth, which is where consumers may know that they need a product, but instead of having to go to the store to determine which product to buy, they just search for it. So now most people actually decide which products to buy based on their searches and based on what's been kind of following them along through their digital footprints across the internet. Well, with the advent of virtual reality, you've got this industry of VR essentially supported by both Google and Facebook, okay, which are the big guys who are working off this zero moment of truth framework. And you've got this highly immersive, interactive platform that can essentially emotionally and figure out the emotional states of the users who are donning these headsets. They're not quite there yet. I'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in terms of the VR technologies, but we can see how the convergence of IoT, wearables, and VR will bring to bear this potential platform that can gather biodata from us and all sorts of other granular forms of data beyond what the internet is currently gathering. So I've sort of coined this and moved it a little bit further to say this is now the sub-zero moment of truth economic framework that could be happening, which is that with this convergence of IoT, wearables, and VR, or immersive media, let's call it that, you could actually have systems that know what you want even before you want it, because you're already providing all sorts of data into the system that they can track and sort out based on your heart rate, based on your breath, how anxious you might have been over the course of the week, etc. So we need to understand as we develop the VR technologies that we're developing, as we develop the VR content that we're developing, that this technology, this platform exists within a particular economic infrastructure. And we need to know, do we want to be part of that? Do we want to create sort of an alternative to that? And how do we do that if we are building these new platforms? So just a hint, there are very few that I've seen open source VR developers out there. Other than OSVR, who are the developers who are really trying to create a much more open-based framework around the technologies that they're creating? And who out there is deciding that the platforms that they're building and then the software that they're providing as middleware VR won't gather data. Okay? So these are, I think, particular philosophical things we need to think about. Oops, sorry, hang on a second. Oh yeah, so this is just an example of some of the people who are actually building these kinds of biofeedback systems. So you know the FOV tracks eyes, it does a bunch of eye tracking. We've also actually designed this stuff ourselves in our own lab. This is Qualia's and Eagle, which marries the Neural Sky headset with a VR platform. So this is tracking your brain waves as you fly like an eagle. In this instance, we're actually using the Neural Sky headset to enable the user to meditate. So it's a meditation VR-based app that we're creating there. The second thing I want to talk about in terms of the context in which we're building these things is locus of control, okay? I almost don't need to talk about this point because the picture says it all. But essentially, you know, we need to figure out, again, who is in control of the data, of this created and mediated immersive imagery that we find ourselves in, or immersive experience that we find ourselves in. John Gaeta of ILM X Lab has a kind of an interesting idea that he shared with me when we did our bit at South by Southwest. And he really talks about how in the future he believes it's going to go from 0 to 100 in terms of this continuum between AR and VR. And that really what will happen is people will, hopefully it's people themselves and not corporations, but that people will have the ability to control how much virtuality seeps into their reality. So whether that's contact lenses or whether that's some kind of head-mounted display, we should be able to figure out whether we just want push notifications because we've got a heavy day, whether we want a much more social and active type of experience with our friends, so it's more like a mixed reality HoloLens kind of environment, or we're really tired and we just want to, you know, check out and we want something much more immersive and closed off of the real world and get into a kind of a void type of experience that we saw earlier. So I think we all agree that that's the kind of future that we want, where there's this kind of continuum of how much virtual extension, you know, the superpowers of virtuality we can extend into our lives, if you will. But the question is, who ends up controlling that? And I think we need to figure out, I keep using the word need, I apologize, but I do think that there's a certain amount of urgency because we are at the stage of VR where all of this can be invented, right? We can be intentional about how we design these things. And so for my part, I'm very interested in meeting with developers and content creators who are thinking about these things, who are thinking about how they are allowing the user to have a certain amount of control over the immersive environments that they choose, that they should choose to intentionally walk into. So if you think this is not, you know, really the case, all you have to do is to look at Oculus Rift's terms and conditions. So you know, this is just purely picked out from the ones that they released. You know, Oculus collects all the data and will do so depending on how much more data can be provided by subsequent iterations of the technology, right? They're allowed to give that data to other third-party providers. And any kind of user-generated content, much like the Facebook system, they will own in VR. So this is a clear kind of marker that we're seeing made by the larger corporations. It's a line in the sand that they've kind of drawn to say, look, we're not necessarily interested in changing the way things are, and we're just going to continue to extend the way things are as we get more into an immersive reality and when we're using more immersive technologies. So as a developer community and as a content creation community, what's our position surrounding this? You know, what do we want to do? Something to think about. The third thing that I think is also important is this notion of network effects. And I think sometimes we forget often that, again, though VR is a one-to-one kind of experience for now, VR is very much, again, embedded in the network digital infrastructure that we've created, okay? So VR is a networked experience, or has the potential to be if we choose to make it so. We know the success of the internet was predicated on content and applications that took advantage of the network effects of the infrastructure in which it was made. So social platforms, look at the largest kind of companies that have emerged, right? Facebook, et cetera. So the question for VR is, what are these native applications in VR that take advantage of the same types of network effects that's particular to the form of digital networked media? I'm not sure if we have actually answered that question yet. The obvious examples are things like social VR applications, et cetera. But what does virality mean in VR? You know, what does sort of sharing of experiences mean in VR? Like, what parts of the experience do we actually share? In this instance, again, we might actually learn from the porn industry. So this is something that I'm sure they're working on quite heavily in terms of how these systems can actually usher in a more kind of shared immersive experience, which takes advantage of that networked capacity of the infrastructure. And then the last point I want to make is this thing called limbic resonance. How many people have heard of that term? Okay, cool, awesome. So it's actually a term that I just recently heard about, and I was so struck by the speaker, Kevin Slavin from MIT Media Lab, also, a two-time entrepreneur. He sold his company Area Code to Zynga. But he uses the term limbic resonance as a framework for when he talks about social TV. Limbic resonance was sort of coined by these authors who wrote a book called General Theory of Love, and it's this notion that the sharing of intense emotional states comes from the limbic system of the brain, okay? And so when you're with your partner or whatever and you're watching something that's compelling, that piece of content becomes even more compelling because there is a person with whom you're sharing that experience. And the limbic part of your brain kind of goes, I know, it zings and when someone's there. So Kevin Slavin talks about this in terms of the laugh tracks in the 1970s. If you watch sitcoms and you take off the laugh track, they become less funny. And his argument is that the laugh track sort of mimics this notion that you're actually in a room full of other friends, and that's what allows that piece of content that you're watching to resonate even further. And so when it comes to VR, I think one of the things that again, we may have not quite understood in terms of the nuance of limbic resonance is for many people, they think that literally just putting yourself in an immersive environment causes empathy right away. You know, we see this all the time talked about, particularly in live action VR experiences with the 360 documentaries. In fact, there's even a TED Talk done by Chris Milk saying that VR is an empathy engine. I can't say how much I totally don't agree with that. Okay? I say it all the time in a lot of my talks, and I'll say it again. And I think it's because of this notion of limbic resonance. It's not about just watching someone suffer in Syria, okay? It's about knowing that you're sharing these experiences or you're sharing your points of view about these experiences with other people. And so I think part of what we need to sort out again in terms of VR is how do we, if let's say the other point I want to make about Kevin Slavin's limbic resonance as it relates to social TV in today's context is that what's happening is the shared mutual experience of films in cinemas was disrupted essentially by the advent of the internet. You know, most people ended up watching their favorite movies on Netflix alone in their room, Netflix and chill. And so he actually argues that Twitter, the rise of Twitter and the rise of second screen applications, is the one that enables that limbic resonance to resurge despite the kind of asynchronous consumption of media content that's happening today, asynchronous to other people, that is. So although we're all Netflix and chilling in our bubble, when we're tweeting about our movies and talking to our friends and engaging in a kind of parallel conversation as we're watching things, that allows for that sharing to happen. So in VR, if with the web, Twitter solved the problem of limbic resonance, the question I have is in VR, what will be that Twitter? What will allow for that social, true social sharing, not just like I see a picture of someone closer up because I'm in a 360, I'm a 360 camera, but what will be that true social sharing kind of application that will enable us to feel that we're, I guess, limbically attached to other people and therefore feel that that experience we're feeling is even better. And that's really why the void and kind of these room scale VR experiences are so powerful because, and I've tried the Artenem version of that same type of experience because you're with your friends. So there's this almost like a tenfold increase of pleasure because even though the system raises anxiety or make you feel scared, you don't feel as badly because your friends are there, and or the experience feels more heightened because your friends are there. So we need to sort that out in terms of VR. So what are some of the design strategies that I think maybe we want to employ as we think about the context that I've just spoken about and as we're designing technologies and content? The first thing that we all have to, I think, really think hard about is this notion of linking payment to consumption, okay? So I don't know how many here have been around since the early 1990s when we started, talking about entertainment on the web, but at that time, there was still this kind of feeling that the internet is free and content should be free. And there was a philosophical reason why we wanted to go that route. But as Jaron Lanier proves over time, this really hurt creators. So again, we want to make sure that within the VR context that we find ourselves in, how are we going to do this? How are we going to link payment to consumption? The good news is I think the blockchain can offer a whole host of solutions potentially to this problem. And so who out there of you, if anyone out here is doing this, please talk to me. Like, who's working on blockchain as it relates to VR, either for identity management or for monetization? Because if anyone else out there is doing that, I really want to talk to you. The second thing is this idea of an unfiltered perception of cyberspace. So there are kind of low-hanging fruit design strategies for this, and then the higher, the difficult stuff that we need to design for. The low-hanging fruit really is, at the very least, transparency around the filters you put on top of people's immersive experience. Meaning, if you are selling data, if you are using user inputs in a variety of ways, how do we create more transparent terms of service models? How do we create more transparent contracts between the users who use our systems and us who make these technologies and systems? How do we make that so that it's not some kind of like link at the bottom of the page and people don't really end up caring about it or searching for it or anything like that? And what happens when there is no link space in virtual reality? Where do they live? I mean, even something as simple as that, where does the privacy and terms of conditions section live in a VR environment? And so we know that there's a bunch of UI issues, but I think we can't forget that there's something we need to do around how to enable people to control what they end up seeing and what they end up deciding to immerse themselves in. And then the last thing is I think we really need to restore the public commons. You know, the web is a completely commercial space. There are no public spaces on the web, zero. It's the same thing as imagining if we live in cities and the parks are commercial. Like, if you look at the cities in which we live, we still pay attention to crafting some kind of public space within the cities we live in, right? And there are certain rules in which we abide because we agreed that we're a community that needs to work together and needs to allow for a certain sense of harmony. As you know, all of us here know that the success of virtual reality is in its complete simulation of reality. And indeed, I think we're going to end up moving into cyberspace in hordes. So how do we make sure that we craft these public commons? So these are just some thoughts that I have as I think this group here designs the future of virtual reality, either through technology or content. But it would be great to work collaboratively together to figure some of these questions out. Thank you. Sorry about that.